Welcome everyone. I'm Carla Quintero. I'm a co-director of the Bridge Project, and I'm also Director of Marketing and Development for HMD. I am coming to you from Oakland, California, which is the occupied ancestral lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. I'm joined today in moderating this conversation about race and contact improvisation by Cherie Hill, who's the co-director of the Bridge Project and also HMD's Director of Art and Community. I'm also really thrilled to be joined by contact improvisation practitioners, educators, activists, Taja Will, Richard Kim, Leslie Heydon, and Rebecca Bryant. Thank you for being here. I want to say that this conversation stems from a shared interest in talking about race and contact improvisation, which we will likely refer to a lot throughout as CI, and also stems from a shared desire of uplifting the work and the experiences of people of color in CI. And we're hosting this conversation as part of our 2020 Bridge Project Festival, which is called Power Shift, Improvisation, Activism, and Community. This is taking place virtually and in San Francisco from September through November 2020. If you're interested in that, you can visit the website, which is bridgeproject.art/powershift. So let's get started. I would like to invite our guests to introduce themselves, starting with Taja.
Hi, I'm Taja Will. I use my name and they, them as my pronouns. And today I am in Minnesota, the stolen and occupied land of the Dakota people in the Anishinaabe-Waukee territory. I am a brown-skinned, queer, Latinx, soft femme Chilena, naturalized citizen of the United States. And in my life right now, I am an artist activist. I am a choreographer. I am an educator and an advocate for artists. I primarily work as a choreographer, and currently my work with choreography is doing diversity, inclusion work, healing justice work, transformational justice work through the understanding and awareness that is improvisational as we bring more of this into the field.
Thank you, Taja. Pass it off to Richard.
Hi, my name is Richard Kim. I use he, him pronouns. I am based in Manhattan, New York, which is the homeland of the Lenape people. This land was called Mannahatta and is currently occupied. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to Carla and Sherry and Hope Moore Dance. And it's great to be on this panel with these other folks. I've been doing contact improvisation since 2002. I've been a dancer and a teacher and an organizer within different communities for that, including New York City and Los Angeles. I run contactimprobblog.com, where I publish my work and the works of other people writing on a variety of issues. I was a recent presenter at the Earth Dance's Consent, Culture, and Contact Improvisation Symposium earlier this year. And I'm the founder of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Scholarship at Earth Dance and was on the DEI committee with Taja until earlier this year. I guess I think of myself within the contact improvisation community, maybe not as an activist. I've certainly agitate things here and there, but I found myself working both inside and outside of the system as it exists. And I can't deny that I have, influence as a teacher and as a facilitator. So I'm sort of working within the current power structures as well as trying to influence them.
Thanks. Shoot it over to Leslie.
Hi. So I'm Leslie Heydon, and I'm located in Toronto, Canada. And the land I'm calling from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis. And I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I'm also really happy and excited to be here. I have been dancing CI for 3.5 years. I am an expressive arts therapist by trade. And for about 2 years, I've been facilitating a Person of Color Jam in Toronto. And through that, I started teaching a beginner's class at the beginning of the jam. And I wouldn't call myself an activist, maybe a baby activist. Through this process of me learning and dancing contact and doing the POC Jam, it's been a process of me finding my voice and yeah, becoming aware of a bunch of things that I'll probably touch on later. And yeah, that's leading me towards a sort of quiet activism. Also, something that I'd like to touch on later is I think I'm the only Canadian in this conversation, and there are many similarities, you know, between Canada and the States, but there are also some differences that also reflect on this conversation.
Thank you, Leslie. And Rebecca?
Hey everyone, really glad to be here talking with all of you. So my name is Rebecca Bryant. I'm calling from Los Angeles, basically, and I'm on lands that are have been traditionally stewarded by the Tongva people. And I've been dancing contact improvisation for 24 years and teaching it for around 19. I've been a co-organizer of a jam, so like a jam facilitator in San Diego for many, many years. And now mostly I teach contact improvisation, and I do that in the academy, and I also do that at festivals. Contact has been a really important form for me. It was one of the first forms that I danced, and it's been a big part of forging my identity as a dance maker. And I actually use contact as a performance form in addition to using it in a dance making process. And I feel lucky because I've been able to dance contact all across the US and in Canada, actually in Toronto, and in several countries in South America and in Mexico and in countries across Europe. And just to say that I have a really interesting relationship with contact right now because I'm teaching a form that doesn't fit into hierarchies very well in an institution, in a big institution that has a lot of hierarchies. So that's kind of like the quagmire that I'm in right now.
Thanks. So let's just dive right in. I guess my first question, why is CI so white? Richard, maybe you can speak to what history set the groundwork for the field to be perceived in this way?
Perceived as white or perceived by, yeah.
Perceived as white is white. I mean, maybe.
Yeah.
What does how do you think of it?
Yeah, it is white. I think, like by any measure, contact improvisation is overwhelmingly white. Contact improvisation is practiced mostly by white people in the United States and in Canada. In communities where there's a high amount of diversity, contact improvisation is overwhelmingly white, including New York City. In places overseas, typically contact improvisation, even in those countries, is done by white people in non-white countries. The few exceptions to that are places like China and South Korea, as far as I know, that have their own local jam culture that's not predominantly white. So content improvisation is, I think, unquestionably a white and white-dominated form. As to why it is that way or it became that way, it's a little hard to unpack. I don't know that we really have like a great, I have an airtight theory about it, but some of the things that I would point to, first of all, just that content improvisation started out as something white. It started out being done by white people, Steve Paxton and Nancy Stark-Smith, who are, you know, arguably the co-founders of the forum, were both white. And the group of people that they gathered around them in the early days, people like Danny Lepkoff, Simone Forti, Nita Little, Nina Martin, were all white. And somehow it never really changed from there. It has always kind of stayed a predominantly white form. And there's a lot of things that we could point to in this. And there's a lot of things that I could say, but maybe just one of the things that I'd point to is something about the egalitarian nature of, or the egalitarian values of content improvisation, which were always really strong from the start, I think have actually contributed to the homogeneity of the forum. So I touched a little bit on this in my symposium video for the Consent Symposium at Earth Dance, but I was mostly talking about it with respect to sex and gender there. But really, I think there's this idea, content improvisation was first done by people who were white, able-bodied, relatively young, educated, relatively high socioeconomic class. And the idea was like, within this world of people who are mostly the same as each other, everyone was equal and everyone treated each other equally. And with that notion, the idea was all you need to do is step into the forum and declare yourself as equal in order to be equal. And I think there's some sort of cognitive dissonance or misperception that's persistent in the forum, where when people step into the forum and don't feel equal, their lack of power or their marginalization is essentially ignored or just not seen. And so that itself becomes a form of exclusion, and then people don't feel welcome and they don't stick around. I think that's maybe one way of looking at this problem, but there are many more, and I'd love to hear what other people have to think.
Well, one of the things I noticed in facilitating the Person of Color Jam in Toronto is that there are a number of people of color who regularly attend the conventional jams and the bigger events in Toronto. However, very few of them attend the POC jam. And in fact, the people who attend the POC jam very seldom go to the regular conventional jams. And some of the things that people attending the POC jam have told me is that they don't feel safe for a variety of reasons at the regular jams. And I also believe another dimension is even where jams are physically located. They're often located in very white neighborhoods. And so that can be a real barrier for people going into a neighborhood that they don't feel comfortable in. Then there's the issue of walking into a room where there's many people that don't look like oneself, so I think that's an issue as well. So it's like the ball rolling downhill continues to perpetuate itself. That's a pretty mixed metaphor, but that's what I think happens. That contributes to it.
I'll jump in and say that, in thinking about like what's kept it so white, my first thoughts were color blindness and economics. So I feel like there's definitely, like, I was born in the 70s, and the way I was raised, and I think a lot of liberal white people were also raised this way, that you should treat everyone the same. And so the way of thinking about combating racism was to then sort of deny the idea of race, treat everyone the same. And this color blindness like seeps into a lot of different things. So it's very easy for white people not to see that they have race. So I think there was the thought that like, okay, contact is really egalitarian. So like everyone should just feel comfortable coming on in. Like, oh, everyone should feel comfortable because the nature of the form is that it's very inclusive. And I feel like we'll kind of unpack that more as we go in this conversation. The other one being economics. So the very first like contact experiment was done by Steve Paxton at a university, and a lot of university students, and then actually a lot of people who practice the form were introduced to contact improvisation in universities. And we can just see from the demographics of who ends up in universities, especially maybe like small liberal arts colleges, like they can tend to be very white in their thinking, and white in the people who are there, and white in who's teaching it. So, you know, I think representation in that way continued this form. I mean, like, the ironic thing is that, oh, well, contact's so open, everyone should feel comfortable. Most jams say that that it's like, pay what you can in order to get into the jam, and if you don't have the money, you won't be turned away. So the irony of like, oh, really it is something that you could continue to practice without a lot of money put forward to just get into the jam. But like, do you have, like, is it actually economically accessible? Like Leslie brought up, like what part of town is it in? Like, can you get to that part of town? Do you have the time and resources? Maybe you're trying to get childcare, da, 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 da. Like there can be a lot of reasons why it can still be economically a challenge to get yourself to where it's happening. And yeah, so I feel like there's something about the color blindness that also dovetails with this idea in the form that everyone's equal, and that there's a lot of debate around the idea that there's like a first rule in contact, that that you take care of yourself first, meaning like, especially if you're in like a situation where you're falling towards the ground, you kind of like take care of your own fall first and then help others after you, sort of like that like on the airplane, like you put your own mask on first and then you assist others. So there's sort of like this thing about it's sort of called the first rule, which a lot of people say like, that's not the first rule of contact, but that's another conversation. But because of that, this sort of this individualism and do what you feel like you want to do and take care of yourself first, that can lead to an environment that, especially if you're part of an underrepresented community, or a community that's traditionally been oppressed, like that doesn't probably feel like a great environment to step into. So and I feel like the color blindness just absolutely lends itself to that, fuels that fire.
And there's also, to dovetail onto the economic piece, that many larger events are organized on a volunteer basis, or that there's a lot of volunteer work involved. And again, that's not always an economic option for people of color.
I do think the economic piece is important, but I don't think it explains everything. Because if you look at sort of similarly situated communities, first of all, just sort of the like mainstream contemporary dance community, whatever that is, right? And then, or if you look at like ecstatic dance communities as well, which typically are sort of a similar population, but actually charge much more for their events, and run on usually don't run on a pay-as-you-go basis. Both those communities, to me, in my experience, are much more racially diverse than contact improvisation. So there's something uniquely exclusionary or counter inclusionary about contact improvisation that's going on. I think it might as well be mentioned that one aspect could be the lack of music in contact improvisation. That by the way, I love the fact that there isn't music in contact improvisation. I'm actually a musician by training, and I find music very distracting to dance to, believe it or not. And so. But you know, in terms of what separates contact improvisation from every other dance form, that's a really big one. And so you might as well throw that into the mix. The other thing that I think is really interesting is like there's this really strong countercultural identity of contact improvisation, that, you know, we are different, we are special. When I went to Berlin and was looking for the jams there, it was just extraordinary, like how difficult they were to find. It was like, you know, go into the entryway, go past 3 courtyards, like find the door that's unmarked, go up 3 flights of stairs. No one will be there. Just hang out until someone shows up. But it's an enormous jam scene in Berlin, despite the way it's completely hidden. And I think a lot of that actually has to do with just the size of counterculture in Berlin itself. That the size of a CI community often scales to how big the size of the counterculture is in that community. You know, I think that often people of color are, I'll certainly speak for myself, I'm hesitant to identify myself with the counterculture because I already feel marginalized within the mainstream culture or within the culture in which I exist. And I feel like being part of a culture, counterculture only marginalizes me further. And I think there's a way that that counterculture is just inaccessible to people in general, but then also unattractive or less attractive for, potentially, for many people of color.
I'll jump in and say, what a privilege it must be to feel so much belonging inside of your body that also you can come and offer it to be touched without any other guidelines perhaps, or any space to say what you need in touch or what you might like. And I think walking into jam culture is exactly that. I have the privilege, or I had the privilege of being introduced to contact in a class form and then following that introduction through education in college. And that gave me the tenacity to understand who I was when I walked into my first non-academic jam space. But how intimidating it must be. And thinking about our bodies and touch as folks of color with the historical trauma of the United States and of Canada, and me as someone who was born outside of the United States, it doesn't make me feel like I can walk into a space where there are people who don't look like me and that I can completely be in belonging with them. It doesn't make me feel like I have the privilege of space and agency.
That makes me really curious, Taja, because I was thinking this kind of a similar thing when Richard, you were talking about the lack of music, maybe being a separation between why there's more people of color, diverse races within ecstatic dance and these other improvisational forms versus contact improvisation. And for me, what popped up is just like the body is so prominent in CI. Like it is really about the body and other bodies coming together and being open to touch, which is very different from many other dance forms. So yeah, so when you were talking about that, Taja, I was like, wow, like I'm curious because you've talked a lot about different reasons why maybe CI isn't as racially inclusive, like access or economics, location. There's not already people of color in there, but are there other like myths, perspectives, maybe even that are connected to this idea of the body and identity that you think happen that keep CI from being more racially inclusive?
I think there's a myth that contact improvisation, and it's sort of the counterculture that Richard had mentioned before, like this myth that contact improvisation is really radical. And it is radical compared to most traditional Western concert dance forms. And so a lot of the first dancers of of contact were coming from. They were all dancing for major companies in New York at the time that were doing Western concert dance, modern and postmodern. And so there's kind of this idea that contact's so radical compared to other kinds of dance training, but it actually carries way more societal norms like within it than kind of gets commonly acknowledged, I feel like. And I'm really speaking from like a white person's perspective right now, that there's this feeling, it's like, oh, contact is so counterculture, but it's like, really, it's not really though. Like, and one of the things is this myth from postmodern dance of a neutral body, that we can just be bodies in a room dancing together, that it's about physics. Like, we're talking about physics and momentum and different forces at play. And that it's just a body, and that myth of that a body can just be a body, like, you can only come up with that myth if you think you're the norm. Like, if you're not understanding that you are implicitly like putting yourself as the norm, as the standard. So in that way, I feel like contact's super white. The other myth for me about contact is that it is inherently inclusive, because it has this idea of it's so egalitarian. So gender doesn't matter, like all these things don't matter. We're people together and everyone has equal agency. And agency, I love that Taja brought that word in, that it's already inherently egalitarian and it's inherently inclusive. I think you can put it in a context where it can very much be completely inclusive, but it's not always necessarily that way. The material, it always has to be in a context, and that context can be inclusive or not. And I'll just say that, so those are sort of like, for me, myths about the form and like collectively that we've held those myths. And then there's a ton of individual myths going on from white folks, and sort of just a general like idea that I have dominion as a white person to be able to do things to and with other bodies. And this is something that I've really had to check in myself, not just as a white person, but as a teacher. Like, when I go to even touch, that there's not necessarily a lot of consent built into sort of Western dance training, and contact does get taught in universities, and we are used to expecting that a teacher will touch students and that students will touch each other for feedback, and it's a very valuable tool, but consent is something that's maybe been assumed for a long time, and I think that's a myth that is, a lot of people are unpacking that right now, and it needs to be unpacked kind of even more, like pulling all the tissue paper out of that. And I think that for me, I think me and my fellow white people need to do a lot of looking at our own individual myths about what we are entitled to when we're in a space. So I think those are all myths that are standing in the way of contact really fully being an equitable situation, an inclusive situation.
So, so contact improvisation is white. There's a lot of really problematic assumptions that are guiding this white practice, but you all practice it and have been doing it for years. There must be some folks that are inspiring you in terms of the ways that they are countering these assumptions, and also working to bring more racial equity and cultural equity into the teaching and the practice of contact improvisation. Can you maybe talk a little bit about work that you yourselves do, and then works that other folks who have influenced you or inspire you are doing to make the field more equitable?
I'll jump in on that. I have a pedagogy that I call a restorative justice pedagogy. And I know that restorative justice has its own definition. And the way that I'm applying this definition to when I teach contact improvisation, when I teach improvisation, basically any time that I'm asked to come in and facilitate or teach, I start with the question, what is the way that you're noticing your privilege today? And let's take out all of the ways that we can acknowledge our systemic privileges. So put those away. I've heard them. I could probably see them about you. Let's assume they're there. What is a specific way you have recognized your privilege today? And privilege then becomes the center point for my pedagogy. We are looking at how privilege is enacted in these spaces. Who is ready to volunteer every time, that privilege of tenacity that I talked about, who is familiar with the space itself, familiar with the form, familiar with me, or brought a friend to class. These are all privileges that we could walk into the room with. And as we center privilege, we understand more about each other as we come into that temporary community that is a dance class or is a jam space that is making work together. I'm going to shout out just a few people, and I'm going to keep it super casual, knowing that this is more, this feels like a culture thing to me. I'm just going to say thank you for helping me stay in June and Mayfield and New and Malaysia and Ish and India. I'm feeling you right now, and I'm grateful. Check.
So I can talk a little bit about some of the people that have inspired and guided me. So one is Andrew Susano in New York and his Park on Resilience work. I remember first coming across him at the Contact Dance International Film Festival. He had a film in about his Park on Resilience. And I remember watching people dance on a subway, and I was like, that's amazing. And he's become a mentor for me in doing the POC Jam. And someone who's also really close to my heart, who's not someone who's well-known or a teacher, but he's a POC dancer in Toronto. His name is Real Aguchi. And I call him my CI midwife. It's a term that he is very amused by because he literally birthed me into contact. We met at a dance camp, and in the contact classes that were there, he would run up to me and go, Leslie, come and do this, try that. And then he bugged me to no end for a day, sending messages to me and my friend, come to the Wednesday Jam, come to the Wednesday Jam, come to the Wednesday Jam. And when I did, he spent the whole jam with me and was teaching me things and making me laugh and made my entry into the jam almost seamless and so supported and so beautiful. And only as I've been dancing it and been in the world and learning more over the past 3.5 years, have I realized how much more he did for me, in that I was able to avoid a lot of common things that people experience, especially women and women of color, when they're first starting to dance CI. And he's very self-effacing, but he's an incredible ambassador. And I've seen him now, he's always doing that, taking someone new under his wing. When he sees someone who looks, unsure of themselves or nervous, he'll do the same thing. And he's always encouraging people to try it out. I also want to mention Kathleen Ray from Raison d'Etre Dance Productions. She's not a person of color. She's a white woman in Toronto, but she has been a huge inspiration for me. She has a diversity scholarship for the Wednesday Jam that she facilitates. And so I had a 6-month scholarship for the class and the jam. That was super helpful for me. She also, her company financially supports and co-produces the POC Jam. And together we facilitated this spring David Camp's White Ally Toolkit, which was a thing that we did to help address some of the myths that we're seeing in the Toronto community around race and CI. And some of the myths that stood out to me are the myth that dancing is apolitical. And a lot of people are like, I don't want to deal with that political stuff. I just want to come here and dance and express myself and feel free. And I think there's a lack of understanding and a lack of belief in the concept of systemic racism. So I still hear a lot of people talk about, well, I'm not racist. I love everyone. And so I think there's a lack of understanding that it's not about individuals being racist. It's about the overarching context that this is all taking place in. And oops. Yeah, actually the other piece I mentioned before already, which is that the lack of understanding of what it's like for people of color to enter an all-white space. So I see some of those as some of the myths and perspectives that are impactful.
I just want to give a quick shout out to some people of color who I think are not very well known in the contact improv world. Funda Gall is a fantastic dancer in New York City who has started teaching. She is currently running the online jams with Cecilia Fontanesi for the New York community, and she's just an amazing mover. She's got 5 years of Aikido and 5 years of Sistema, a Russian martial arts dance. And she's always, Russian martial arts form. And she's always integrating new things into her dance. Incredibly athletic, super nice, just a great person. And, someone I'm really happy to know. Also in New York City, Tanya Velasquez is running a new jam in a martial arts studio. And that consistently brings a diverse set of people. Usually, often it's 50% or more people of color. And Tanya's been really great at sort of making that jam welcoming and open and fun. And then, Leslie knows Henry Way in Toronto as well, who's just a fabulous human being, and just like generations of people in Toronto have their first dances with Henry because, like Real, he's someone who's really looking out for who's new in the space and who might need some welcoming in. And also, he's a fantastic dancer, and I know Henry will probably downplay that if he hears this video. But Henry, you're great. I mean, he's just got great agility and strength, and like really great rolling point skills, and creative and fun. And so I just think people don't know what a treasure he is. In terms of things that I've been doing or been involved with in contact improvisation, the sort of big thing that I did was I started the Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Scholarship at Earth Dance with Sarah Young, who's the then executive director. And we had a lot of people who kind of helped out along the way. Taja and Nicole Bindler were some of the people who really have contributed a lot over the last few years. Nicole and I have spent hours on the phone together around that scholarship. And over 6 years, we brought 30 people to Earth Dance following Lee's Jam for the first time. And a lot of people around the United States and Canada, a few people, I think, from other countries. including Leslie, yeah. And that's been, I think, really great. I wonder about the long-term effects of the scholarship. Like, the idea was to kind of bring people more into the forum and sort of give them tools and confidence and networking and invitation to then go out and continue their work in the forum. And I think it succeeded in some ways, but I do wonder sometimes whether we could have more impact doing other things or taking on other initiatives. But I think what's always been a pleasure for me at the Falling Leaves Jam is to, particularly in recent years, have these moments where it feels like that jam is really sensitive to social justice issues, so sensitive to identity and oppression issues. Often a much more diverse jam than other jams at Earth Dance or other jams in the contact improvisation world. And like just these little glimmers of like, oh, this is what the contact improv world could be like. I think those have been priceless for me, even if we are not able to recreate it for every jam. And then the work on the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Scholarship turned into the DEI committee, which Taja and Nicole were also on with me. And there we started pushing for different kinds of initiatives at Earth Dance to be more sensitive to a broad range of social justice issues. And so those have all been things that have been really important to me. And Andrew and I, this is a little smaller, but Andrew Susana and I started the POCCI posse, People of Color in Contact Improvisation Facebook group. And I don't know how many members we're up to now, but I enjoy just like looking at the Facebook group and just seeing all the pictures of people and like seeing a collection of people who I wouldn't ordinarily see in contact.
So I want to ask a question about racism in CI. The other day I was being interviewed on a local radio station for the Bridge Project Power Shift Festival, and the interviewer said, "Oh, you're having an anti-racism training," and I'm paraphrasing, but they were like, "Oh, but this is dance. I didn't think that racism existed in dance. Like, I thought everyone got along," which I was just like, "Oh, okay." Kind of threw me for a loop there. But so our question is around racism and CI. Have you experienced or seen racism happening, and in what ways has it manifested, if so?
I'm gonna jump in. I can't tell you how many times I have been called an agitator or an interrupter, or been told that I have an oppressive agenda of social justice in CI. Okay, I have 4 statements. We don't have a ton of time left together, so pick a number, Leslie, between 2 and 4, and I'll give you a couple of the statements that I've heard about myself. 4, great. Okay, I'll do it. I'm prepared here. So this is participant feedback that was given directly to me. These people knew they were speaking to me about some of my social justice initiatives or diversity and inclusion initiatives. There's a lot of different names for it, these political initiatives that I have, this agenda to oppress other people. So, quote, "I understand that all this diversity and inclusion, in quotes, stuff is well-meaning, but I disagree very strongly both with the philosophy behind it and the specific actions taken. When the opening circle is created in an oppressive atmosphere, no one feels safe, especially the people who do not share your philosophy." Next quote, "As a Caucasian, I actually feel less comfortable with people of color, noticing the differences more. The microaggression video had me scared to say anything that was wrong." Next quote, "I like diversity and I like equality in society, so at some level we're on the same team. But I disagree very strongly with the social justice movement of the past few years. I think that this movement as a whole has come to constitute one of the biggest problems that Western society is facing today. The great thing about contact improvisation is that it provides a way for people to come together without so much of this usual social baggage." The next one is from the CI community that I used to practice in, where I'm home based in. And this is maybe the last jam that I went to here in Opening Circle, where no one did land acknowledgement or invited access needs or talked about guidelines. After I introduced myself, I said, can I share something? And the facilitator of that day said, what do you want to fight about today? And this is just a snapshot of the work that I have done with organizations for a long time or tried to do in my home community and the response that I feel and see. And these are ones that are directed directly at me. This is not about what's happening in the room and the scapegoating that is happening to people of color working on these social justice initiatives largely throughout the country. Richard, I'm going to pass it over to you because I'm super excited to hear you tell this story.
So let me say a few things first. Like, we all on this call know this. I think probably most of the people watching this video know this, but I just want to kind of lay out the groundwork of racism, just so we're on the same page, if anyone out there doesn't sort of understand this. There's lots of flavors of racism. There's like hardcore racism, which is like, you know, discrimination in housing or epithets or, you know, bullying. And those things exist in the world. I'm sure some of them exist in content improvisation. I think in my experience are relatively rare. And then there's the much more common sort of everyday implicit bias, unconscious racism, privilege, fragility in particular in content improvisation that we see, that I see much more of. And there's a lot of people who just don't really see people of color. Like they sometimes literally don't see people of color. And I'll maybe tell a story about that a little bit later. But the story that Taja and I have been talking about comes from Earth Dance. So there were two white facilitators who were invited to come to Earth Dance to facilitate one of the seasonal jams. And the situation was that Taja and I, as members of the DEI committee, were going to meet with them and some other people who were involved in some of the people involved in the facilitation of the jam in order to go over sort of what their roles were and what the expectations were around DEI. So what happened was these two facilitators got on the call with us. Deirdre Morris, the executive director, was also on the call. A member of the CI committee was also on the call. That's the committee that found the facilitators and invited them. As I recall, it's been a while, but as I recall, what happened was we were talking about the values of Earth Dance as stated at that time, which included diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. An explicit commitment to social justice, I think, is in the Earth Dance vision. And we were asking the facilitators whether they supported that and how they would support it. And as I recall, the facilitators said something like, yes, we're very in favor of social justice. We're going to offer some of that in our jam. And we were like, okay, cool. What does that mean you're going to offer some social justice stuff in the jam? And they gave a sort of vague answer like, we're going to integrate something into our classes. And we kind of pushed them a little bit on that and said, it's really important at the jam to kind of like handle these things carefully. There's a facilitator who we're bringing in who's a DEI expert who you can work with to develop this material. But this is something that really needs to be taken with a lot of care and caution. And if you're not equipped to do it, it's fine to say so. But you just need to be clear that the jam is a complicated social environment. This is how I remember it. Is this about right, Taja?
This is right. The thing that I would add is that they had presented a full schedule of who was facilitating different classes and offerings, and all of them were white folks.
So as I recall, what happened next was after we got off the call, and I think a few days later, both the facilitators sent an email to the CI committee expressing that they were quitting the jam, and that they were doing so for various reasons, but essentially one of them, as I recall, said that they felt uncomfortable with the questioning that they'd received around diversity, equity, and inclusion. They essentially felt surprised by being asked to support these values, and felt sort of like, I want to say like ambushed would be maybe how I would kind of put myself in their shoes. Following that, the Content Improvisation Committee wrote a letter in which they asked the board of directors of Earth Dance to make sure to pay the plane fare of the two facilitators who had quit, as well as to apologize to them for what they had endured at the hands of the DEI committee. So I just think this is sort of an incredible textbook example of white fragility, where the facilitators really couldn't handle being questioned about how they would support DEI efforts, even though we were pretty much explicitly saying, this doesn't have to be your area of expertise. We just want to know what you're doing, and if you do it, to do it with care. And then also the I think all white or nearly all white Content Improvisation Committee sort of identifying immediately with the shame and sense of awkwardness that the facilitators felt, and leaping to their defense, even to the point of irrationally like asking Earth Dance, a nonprofit organization, to pay for plane fare of people who had unilaterally quit on their jam with like 3 weeks to spare or something like that.
And it's a volunteer position. So I'm gonna fill in a few other details. I really value confusion in learning and transparency and the messiness of all of this work. And I think that's something I bring into my consulting practice. Richard and I both have pretty long time relationships with Earth Dance and with a lot of these people, some close relationships, some not as close. These facilitators did say that they were confronted by our questioning. They also had said, we're not experts. You shouldn't expect us to be experts. They also said that we were, or again, I'll take me into this, I was being oppressive to them feeling liberated and free to create the container that they wanted to create. From my position of leadership as another committee. And then this other committee is upholding these people who were invited to be volunteer facilitators and hold space. I feel like this also that has an eraser in it, because the committee had presented several names. Our committee had presented several names of potential facilitators who were folks of color. We'd had conversations asking that they bring more folks of color to facilitate. Both of these people were white. And these people were people that I personally was very familiar with, not having allyship or literacy in social justice work, especially in the CI jam spaces that they hold. But our committee then, who's trying to work hard with this other committee, did not work in tandem. They were invited. I was not surprised at the outcome. I was surprised that the volunteers asked for their airfare to be compensated. But then the aftermath is still rolling out, I would say, as someone who works closely with Earth Dance now, that there's still confusion. What happened? How did this happen?
Lots of stories.
That jam, what a shame that these beautiful dancers that we know quit, and why. And it keeps playing into this fact that the social justice work is an interruption to the flow, the liberation, the freedom that people who have the privilege to feel belonging in these spaces and in their own bodies get to have by practicing this form. These facilitators that were invited, that quit, had asked me previously, why is it you don't practice contact improvisation? Like, why can't you do that here? There's such an eraser of the experience or the needs as a person of color, as a person who has been doing contact 20 years, who's been a teacher in my community, for people who, wow, this is hard. It's hard to not name people who have been close to me or to in my community, but people who had studied contact with me since they were very young people, to not understand how I did not feel space in a room. I take a lot of things personally. Oh my goodness. That's another thing about contact that I think is when you feel the belonging, when you find the flow, when you are in community, I think what a lot of people feel is like, this is love, this is spirituality, this is home, this is belonging. And what a privilege to be able to feel that, and what deep isolation to walk into a space with desire and skills and facility or not, and not be able to find a way to that, or not be able to walk into the space, and not have access to that at all.
I just did want to jump in really quickly and say, like, there is actual racism in contact improvisation. A really great example was I was attending a large weekend jam, and there was like a talent show. They often have like these talent show nights where people just kind of present little aspects of their community. And there's one incident where a very prominent contact improvisation teacher basically did brownface in a skit where he dressed up as an Indian guru and spoke with an accent, and it was horrifying. And people laughed, and no one like protested. It was years ago. It was maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So I would hope that people would have a reaction now, particularly like the younger generation of people who are coming to the contact scene are much more attuned to these issues. But that was just straight up racism.
The way that microaggressions and cultural appropriation show up in jam spaces is wild. I don't know if it's happening right now. I mean, not right now, because we're not really touching each other right now, even though I know some virtual jams are happening, but I haven't been in jam culture in a little while. Is it still happening? Wild.
Yeah, I have like 2 more crazy stories, but I want to hear other people talk first.
Well, I can share that I was at a multi-day jam at Earth Dance, and I was one of 2 women of African descent there. And besides us being women of African descent, we were different in every other way. Actually, very different complexions, different hair, different height, different body shape, different body size, different personalities. That's all we shared. And the amount of times that people would confuse us, call me her name, call her my name. It was, I suppose I shouldn't have been, but I continued to be astounded by that.
Wow. Sounds like a soap opera. Anyway, I guess I'm just curious in particular, Leslie, since you mentioned some of your work with white allies, and then also Rebecca as well, if there's a counter experience to this where maybe this work or this I guess introduction of the perspectives of people of color has been met with a different kind of reaction within the field. And then also just curious about some of the more positive experiences that this work has brought about for all of you.
And jump in. I think one thing that I was thinking about in terms of like how racism shows up, and I'll just say, like, admittedly, as a white person, it's harder for me to see when it happens. Like, I've had to learn how to look for it. And I think that's something that other white folks like need to do that training. That's part of like the work right now. But like one of the ways I've noticed racism show up is that when there are conversations about race, like there's no white people there. And this is I'll say this like in general about dance, like the kind of dance world that I'm a part of, this kind of contemporary Western dance form, that there's been, you know, for years and years and years, there have been conversations about race, and white people haven't been showing up. Now, in the wake of the reaction to the murder of George Floyd, we've seen this shift. And I'm like, oh, okay, white people are showing up now for these conversations. How long is that gonna last? Is like my first cynical thought, because I feel like I've seen this go through waves before. And yeah, I the other way that I feel like I've seen racism show up is there was sort of this trend at a certain point, like that had to do a lot with funding. So how are you going to fund your dance company? Oh, you need to make sure that you work with underserved populations, which there's all kinds of, like, you know, code words for meaning, like, oh, different racial groups. And that this idea of like increasing diversity of your audience, increasing diversity, and it usually started with audience, right? It didn't start with like, oh, you need to increase the diversity of your dance company. No, increase the diversity of your audience and you'll get funding. And so I felt like I started seeing people chase after the idea of diversity, but it felt like it wasn't for the right reasons. It wasn't because you're actually interested in bringing in different people into the room, into the process, into the work, because ultimately I think, and I feel like it's kind of come up in what people have been saying in terms of, and maybe it was Taja, it reminded me of this, of like, okay, so we want to bring diverse people into the form, but we want our form to stay exactly the same. Like, the tension of that the more people and the more ideas you get into the room, the more mutable and a form will evolve. And I think all art forms evolve. Like, I can't think of an art form that doesn't evolve. And so I guess I've seen rigidity around the form. Yeah, it was this idea of like, I'm less free now because you're bringing social justice ideas into the room. You've infringed on my freedom, which is like, what? And oh, I see, because there's this very white way of thinking about freedom and being able to do whatever I want within contact that's like, okay, we don't want to give that up. We don't want to give that up. And we've actually seen that actually quite a lot with men when we've been confronting them about issues around consent and how women or femmes have felt in jam situations. And yeah, well, I'm just kind of, now I'm just sounding off. Because I feel like, Carla, you're also asking for some, what is the joy? You're asking about the joy. And I feel like I've actually felt increased freedom in the form as I've brought more consent into the space and more that I've been dancing with more and more different kinds of people from different backgrounds. I've felt increased freedom in the form, and that has been a real joy. I think, like, I've noticed an exponential multiplication of metaphors and approaches to doing the form that I was closed off to before, because I was stuck in sort of a white supremacy mindset. And I feel like the layers of connection between people for me have really deepened through diversification in contact. So that's like the beauty. And so it's even more upsetting when you hear people say that they feel less free. It's like, what is happening there?
In terms of like a positive moment, I think about and maybe Leslie will help me with the story here. I think about the Ontario Regional Contact Jam last year in 2019. As I recall, and again, Leslie, help me out here if you remember it differently, but they did a land acknowledgement at the beginning of the jam that was kind of botched. And I think the facilitators will acknowledge it. I don't quite remember how it was botched. I think it was like, there was like it was never quite clear that the land acknowledgement was a land acknowledgement. I think they didn't name any specific tribes. It was something like there were people here and now they're not people here. And
it was very generalized,
very vague,
very watered down.
And so what happened actually was a number of people, I think in Andrew Ceseno's Parkon class and perhaps other people like complained to the facilitators. And what happened was actually, for me, pretty beautiful, which is that at the closing circle, they then took a preamble where they kind of recounted what had happened. And they just said, we screwed it up. We did it wrong. We didn't get it right. And then they did a long land acknowledgement that named the people and named the space and said everything really explicitly. And I teared up because it was just one of these situations that I don't often feel in contact improvisation. These moments where people just take full responsibility for what happened and then make the effort to address it. So often, like, it's like we push it aside, we forget about it, we try to pretend it didn't happen. But to those facilitators' credit, to the organizers of the Ontario Regional Contact Jam, to the Toronto community and everyone who said things to them, to all of their credit, it was really a moment of like, okay, we screwed up, let's fix it. And that was really great.
Yeah, and they were very explicit about that too. They said, we got it wrong. Yeah. And yeah, we want to make it right. Yeah. Well, one of the other things they did is that year when the POC Jam was scheduled was at the very end of the 3-day event. Mm. And I found it was a time when I think people were really winding down. It was also, there wasn't an opportunity for all the POC people there to, connect early on and so have allyship through the whole jam. So when I was in conversation with them in the organizing of the jam that didn't happen this year because of the pandemic, but I named that and they were really gracious and they said, yeah, great. We'll schedule a longer time, we'll schedule it sooner, and we'll schedule some other events to help build more allyship. So again, they were responsive that way. And some of the other positive things I've seen is I've seen more writing by people of color about contact. I've seen more POC people starting to arrive at larger events. And I was on the jury for the Contact Film Festival last year, and we're seeing more and more entries from people of color in different places of the world. And that's been really heartening.
Yeah, keep your eye on India. There's incredible things happening in India, not necessarily at the Goa Festival, which is still sort of European dominated, but there's a huge set of people outside of Goa who are really like spreading the form throughout the Indian country.
Taja, I want to give you a chance to call it a positive before we wrap up.
Yeah, I wanted to say that my favorite place in the world to dance is WikiJam, the West Coast Contact Improvisation Festival that happens in Berkeley. We didn't get to have one this year, but I would have been there. And that collective of organizers has held such incredible allyship in many ways. And like all communities, it's really complex. And I feel them. I can dance there. I have space there. I can breathe there. I am just so grateful to be able to go there once a year and really feel my full dance.
Well, Taja, Leslie, Richard, Rebecca, we really want to thank you for your time today and for sharing your experiences and for all the work you're doing to create more diversity and inclusion and equity within contact improvisation. It's really been a pleasure to have you all, and we really appreciate everything you're doing. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.